Lolita, and in this video I'm going to demo the color wheel that is just over my shoulder. That's the 12 color wheel. I'm going to be demoing it in watercolor for you, and we're going to be using that Koi Sakura set that I had you order in your kits. And yes, this is a demo that I'm making for my Design 1 students, my 107 class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to create a 12 color wheel in watercolor, and we're going to only be using the primary colors to mix up all 12 colors. I'm going to show you how to use a compass to make that circle. If you don't have a compass, I'm going to show you how to ad-lib and use a plate to make that circle. If you have a compass, I'll show you how to use the compass to locate the center of that circle. And if you don't have a compass and you've got a plate, then I will show you how to create a square around that, so that way, to create a square around this circle, so you can locate the center of the circle that way. And that is what we are going to be doing in this demo video. I'm also going to show you how to use a protractor to find the different segments of the little 30-degree segments of your 12 color wheel, or I'm also going to show you how you could approximate that. I hope you enjoy. So today we're going to be doing the 12-part color wheel, and this is the start of our color theory. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a compass to create an 8-inch circle on this paper. And in order to do that, if we use a compass, we're going to line up the anchoring point and the tip of the pencil so that the span measures 4 inches, and that gives us a 4-inch radius, which of course will give us an 8-inch diameter circle. So what I'm going to do here is just start this somewhat in the middle of in the horizontal middle, and about 1 inch down vertically. And I'm just going to move this around. If you're using a compass and this is your first time using a compass, you want to, so I let mine slip. So you want to place the most pressure on the center point and just let the pencil glide around. And I'm just going to put a mark here. So before I complete my color wheel, so I'm just putting a mark here, and that's where the center of my circle is. If you don't have a compass, go to your kitchen and maybe get a little saucer and use that instead. It won't be quite as easy to know exactly where the center is if you use one of these little saucers and just place it face down and trace it that way. But if you do, you'll get a nice perfect circle. And then in order to find the center of a circle, what you do is you draw a square around it. And just got another pencil here, and for those of you who don't have a compass and mark the center like I did, what you can do is you can find the center of the circle by first placing it in a square. And you don't have to really measure out the square. You can just put lines and make sure that the lines are straight, true horizontals and true verticals. And you do that by getting a straight edge like a ruler and lining up that vertical edge, the line that creates a vertical edge. Line up that line with the vertical edge of your paper and do the same on the other side. Line up the vertical edge with the lines that go through the ruler. Slide your ruler all the way up to the end of the circle, right to the edge of the circle, and just make a line that you know is going to go the distance at least 8 inches, which is what this circle is. And what we're going to get here is an 8-inch rectangle. But again, you don't have to measure it. You just have to make sure that you have your square around the circle. You just need to make sure that your lines are true verticals and true horizontals, and they're parallel to the edges of your paper. So, and again, you can do that. I'm doing the same process each time by lining up. So this time I've switched the direction of the paper so it looks vertical again, but let's just stick with it being the horizontal edges. So I've lined it up with the edge of the paper again, and I'm going to line up this edge with the edge of the paper to make it, and pull back and line up that ruler with the edge of the circle. And because I know where the edge of my square is now, I'm only going to make the line that length and take it all the way up to make sure that I've got it long enough. And again, we don't have to be precise here in the measurement. We just need to be precise in the verticality and horizontal direction of your lines that create the border of your square. So again, moving it down and using the line that I've already got established here, taking it across, making sure that I have enough distance to consider how far the edge is, and once again lining this up so that I get a straight edge all the way down. And let's just move this down so I can see this edge. That's a nice edge there, and another nice one here. And just move that in, and okay, hold that straight. And I'm just going to go from one, and I've got my square around my circle. And I'm not going to measure it, but that is going to be an 8-inch square. And so now to find the middle of the circle, we're just going to go from one edge of the square, one corner, to its opposite diagonal corner. And we're going to put a line through that angle from one diagonal corner to the next, all the way up. Turn your paper for access, and then we are going to do the same thing where we go from the other diagonal corners and put a line through our circle, or our square rather, from corner to corner. And mess that one up just a little, and so I'm going to go in. All right, so a line from corner to corner. And then that gives us the center, and look, it's the same place as we located with the compass. So now what we've got is, looks like a train track sign almost, but we've got the square, the circle and the square. So we've got the circle divided into 4 segments, and that's what we want. And each segment is going to represent it's going to have 3 segments in it each. And the 3 segments, so this is the 12 color, so this is a 12 color color wheel, 12 color. And so each 4 will be divided into 3. And in order to get it divided into 3, we can look at either the perimeter of the circle and try to guess and subdivide it into about 3 even portions. And if I'm looking, it would be, for me, it would be about one about here. And then I'm going to look and see where I've marked that, and then go and have about the same angle or measurement on the other side. That looks a little, the middle one looks a little wide. So I think I probably would say it's closer to something like that. And then if I don't have a compass, I'm rather a protractor like I've got, that's what you want to do. And you can just sort of guess, and you would still use the same process that I'm showing you. You only have to do 2 of the 4, mark only 2 of the 4 with your guess marks or your precision marks if you're using a protractor, because then you would just draw the line through the middle and you get the reciprocal angle already on the other side. So you only need to mark 2 of the 4. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure out the angle because I've got a protractor. And my protractor works so that I've got a little circle in the middle, and that is where I line it up in the middle of the middle of my circle. And then I've got little lines here to indicate where it would line up with the lines I've got drawn through the middle of my circle. And you see that on one end it says 180 and the other end it says 0, and that's because half of a circle is 180 degrees. So we know that 30 degrees, because this is a 90-degree angle, so we know we have 30 degrees. We know we have 360 degrees in a circle. So that's what we're going to mark off here. We're going to mark off, I've got this lined up 90 degrees. And so we know that if we take 30 degrees or add 30 degrees to 90, that's going to be 120. And then I'm going to make another mark at 150. And notice that I'm making the marks, and I'm making them so that way they are on the same angles as the trajectory that they would come out at. So it's something of converging parallel lines. So they're going to lines that would converge from the middle. So I make them at that same angle that is indicated by the notch on the protractor. Okay. Now that I've wiggled this around a little bit, I'm going to settle it back in, and I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to mark every 30 degrees. So we know that 30 away from 90 is 60, and again, I'm marking it that same direction, and then 60 minus 30 degrees is again 30 degrees. And so I've got those lines drawn there, and you can see already that they are in the same general direction as the angles that I actually want to establish. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to go through the middle of the circle again and line it up with those notches that I've made, and go from one end of the edge of the circle to the other end and make a nice strong diagonal line through the entire circle. And that's one of our 30-degree angles. Let's do one more. And we can see that it took it all the way through, and we did not need to measure on the other side. So then I'm going to line it up with my notch, line it up with the middle of the circle, and I'm going to put another diagonal line all the way through from one end of the circle to the next. And so you can see I've got 2 of my squares already taken care of, and I'm going to finish off my 12 color wheel, and we're making 12 segments here. So this is how we make 12 segments through that circle. Okay, look, I'm going to do it one more time from edge to edge of that circle, and then the last time that's going to give me my final 12 segments. So I'm just lining that up, and I wasn't too far off. You can see from my guess marks that I wasn't really too far off. So guessing is a good alternative, and you don't really have to be entirely precise with this. It's good to learn how to measure angles, but the main idea that we're going for here is to get 12 segments that are relatively even, and you can get them fairly precise by using the protractor. Again, I'm going to go in and erase the excess lines that I don't need, and so I don't need them in my I'm going to be painting in these segments, and I don't need them at all. They're not part of my final design, so I'm just going to get rid of those. Go in and clean it up really nicely. Okay. So now what we want to do is we want to label our 12 color wheel. And it doesn't really matter where we start or which color we start with. But what we are going to do is we are going to start with the primary colors. So the primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. And those are primaries because you can't take any other two colors and mix those two colors and get a blue or a yellow or a red. But you can mix all 12 colors from just these three colors. So all 12 colors that we're going to put in this color wheel, we're going to have primary colors. And so these are primary. And then we're going to have the secondary colors. And the secondary colors are created when you mix two of the primary colors. So if I mix red and yellow, I get orange. So that's one of my secondary colors. If I mix yellow and blue, I get green. So that's one of my secondary colors. If I mix blue and red, I get purple, or in this case, we're going to call it violet. So we get violet, and I'm going to put out here in parentheses that it's also purple. Those are interchangeable, but just where we are in the modern paradigm, we use violet when we're referring to the 12-step color wheel. And those are the secondary colors. So we've got secondary colors after that. And then we've got what is called tertiary colors. And now tertiary colors happen when you take red or you take a primary and you add it to a secondary. So a primary and a secondary put together, that makes a tertiary color. And the naming protocol, when you make those tertiary colors, you always use the primary name first, and then you use the secondary name second. So the tertiary colors are going to be red, orange. And let's get into that just before we finish labeling this. Let's see why and how and what direction we're going to label this. So since I put red, yellow, and blue, let's just start out here with this top segment, and let's call this one red. So then what we want to do is we know we need to paint three of these, the primary colors. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave 1, 2, 3 blank, and on the fourth one we're going to write in another primary color. And so because I've written yellow, we're going to go ahead and write yellow here. So we'll put yellow. And then let's count 3 more spots. 1, 2, 3. And leave those 3 blank. On the fourth one, we're going to write blue. And so now we've got all of our primary colors labeled. So what we see now is I've got red, yellow, and blue. So those are my 3 primary colors. Now let's label the secondary colors. Now the secondary colors, remember, those happen when you mix two of the primaries. So halfway in between on your color wheel is going to be orange, because if we mix red and yellow, halfway in between those, we're going to get orange. So we've got 3 segments between red and yellow. In the middle one, we're going to put orange. So let's label that one orange. And then let's turn our color chart. And we see that we've got 3 segments between yellow and blue. So then on the middle one, we know if we mix yellow with blue, we get green. So we're going to label this one green. So this section we're going to paint green. Then we've got another middle one that is in between red and blue. And for that one, we know we're going to get violet, so we're going to label that one violet. So halfway between red and blue is violet. That's the color you get when you mix red and blue, you get violet. So let's see those tertiary colors. So those tertiary colors are going to be the colors that are in between the primary and the secondary. And they're going to be named a combination of the primary first and the secondary second. So let's look at those in between colors. So for red, we've got red, orange. So we're just going to label the section between red and orange. We're going to label that red, orange. Let's turn it back the other direction and let's see what else we have for red. So for red, what's also between red, what's next to red is an empty one, and so the next color is violet. So what's between violet and red, that's going to be red, violet. So let's label that one red, violet. Okay, let's write red, violet down here so this way we know all of the names of the tertiaries. So that we're going to have a red, violet also. And remember, it's always the primary name that's going to go first, and then the secondary color name goes second. So let's start with, then move to yellow. And so we've got yellow and we've got orange. We've got a blank segment between yellow and orange. We know that we are going to start with the primary first and then list the secondary. So what's going to go into this segment is going to be yellow, orange. So primary name first, secondary name second. Let's see what else we've got. So yellow and then green, and we've got that missing segment. So what's going to be between yellow and green? That's right, yellow, green. So let's label that segment yellow, green. Yellow, green. All right, that's going to allow us now to move over to the blue and label the 2 blue. So between blue and green, we've got an empty segment, and we know that we use the primary color name first and the secondary color name second. So we're going to label this one blue, green. Perfect. And we've only got one of our 12 segments left, and it's a blue, and it's between blue and violet. So we know we're going to label this one blue, violet. Okay, and that's going to be perfect. And now we've got our color chart completed and labeled. Now we're going to paint it in. And to paint it in, let's start with the red. And remember, the only colors, we're going to make all 12 colors from 3 primary colors. So let's do that. 12 color wheel. So we've got a 12 color wheel using only primaries. So using only primary. Oops. I don't know where I got that T from. I guess I wanted to cross my T's before I dotted my I's. So primaries. So using only primaries to mix all colors. To mix all colors. To mix all colors. So we know we don't have to mix red, and we're just going to use the red from our set. So the set that we've got here is this Sakura Koi, and you can see I've already been using mine. And what we want to do first is we want to just, and I've pre-wet these a little. These from our set, we're going to use this number, let's see, it says 52, I believe. This number 52 is going to be our yellow. And I've already pre-wet that, so I'm going to just take some of that pigment and put it out into where I had my yellow section to add to the paint I have there already. And I'm just going to add some water here. And since I've only got yellow in my dirty water so far, it's okay for me to use yellow and reactivate all of this wonderful yellow that I've got in my palette. So remember, we want to just go ahead and get that reactivated. And since that is the paint that I have already selected here and already reactivated, let's go ahead and turn this a little, and let's paint in the yellow segment first. It doesn't matter which segment you paint in first, but remember, you never, ever, ever want to paint directly from your pans. You want to take the paint from your pans and transfer them onto your palette. So whether you're using the extraneous palette like I'm using, or if you're using the palette that is in your kit, you want to make sure that you're not painting from your pan here. You always take the paint from your pan and make a nice mix with water, and give yourself a nice mix of water and paint, and that is what you're going to use to apply your paint to your paper. We're not going to be painting from here. So this is learning how to paint with watercolor correctly, and it's correctly, and with moving it from your pan to your palette. So what we're going to do here, and this is why I was a little hesitant to say entirely correctly, because we're going to be painting flat, and it's a lot easier to paint if you paint with watercolor on an angle. But because we don't really have ideal settings here, we're just going to try to mimic the idea of painting on an angle. And I'm just going to tilt my, I'm going to move that up a little. I'm just going to tilt my paper up, just so that way I have a little bit of gravity working for me. And I've got, I'm going to move this around too so you can go out of the way. So I've got a little better access to the paints. Since I've been talking, I wanted to just add a little bit more water because this dried a little, so I just want to make sure I've got the right viscosity. So what I'm going to do here is just allow gravity to work for me. And we'd already started working with our skills before, and with the idea of the bead and what I like to call a live edge. And you want to, I'm using my number 6 from my kit. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking my brush, the tip of the brush, and moving it right up to the edge of that segment of my color wheel, to the edge of this, that defines this segment. And you see what I'm doing is I'm keeping the edges here wet, and what that's going to allow me to do is go back in with more paint and allow it to just slowly glide down the surface of the paper. I can see that that live edge or my bead is getting a little dry, so I'm going to go and reload a little more paint into my brush, and I'm going to go into that bead with my newly loaded brush, pull that down to control where the paint is actually moving, since we're working wet into dry. And then that keeps that idea of the bead or that live edge still going. And I can see I've got a good amount of paint sitting there. So I can just take that and physically move it over the surface of the paper, and I've got that nice bead edge. And I'm looking at my paintbrush and I feel physically that I can go back in and load a little bit more paint. So this way I'm going to have enough paint to keep moving down the surface of this paper and filling this segment. And I can see my bead building really nicely here, that live edge. You can see that puddle there. And just from that puddle I can gauge. We want to start gauging. I can already gauge, and I want you guys to start developing that idea of gauging how far that little puddle will go. And I feel it'll probably extend all the way to the end of that little slice segment of the color wheel. And I'm moving it just a little physically closer so that way I can direct the paint a little better and make sure that it actually falls into the segment that I've created for it rather. And so that's our first segment, and we've already put the yellow in. What I want you guys to be open to is going in, and if what you get at first is a little too light, because I want to have these color wheels saturated, and they should be completely as saturated as this color wheel here. These are the colors that you're aspiring to. So I'm just going to place this here, and those are the colors that you are aspiring to. You want to get that level of saturation. If you don't get that level of saturation the first time that you paint your segment in, leave your paint nice and pure in your palette, let it dry, and go back over it again with a second layer. What you want to do is you're going to have some patience, and you're going to have to let each segment dry before you go in and apply the next color. And this is to keep one segment from bleeding into the next. What you can do is move around the wheel and access another area that does not touch what you are working with already, or the edges that you have wet, and paint that in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint my blue in at this time, and I'm rinsing my brush out, again cleaning it out in my dirty water, but this time I'm not going to be using my dirty water again because it's going to get contaminated from this point forward. So I am going to, I've got the blue, and the blue that we are using is definitely this number 147 in our kit. So look where it's located, and this is the blue that we're using. This is a closer to an ultramarine blue. And what I also like to do is a trick I like to do to save paint is I will take clean water and on it from a different brush and just transfer only clean water over. If you have a dropper, you can use a dropper, and that's a really good method of transferring clean water both to your palette and your pans. So you can also use a dropper and just drop clean water directly onto your palette to reactivate your paint. So I've got all of this blue paint, and this is just pure blue paint that I've mixed up from this. And what I mean by mixed is I mixed it with water. This feels a little too viscous, so I'm going to add just a little bit more water to it to make it flow just a little better. It felt like it just had a little too much friction when I'm moving it across my palette here. So let's see if I like this. And what I could do is I might as well, I've got this paper here, and I'm going to just use it as a test paper to see what it is I've got on my brush. And I think I can be happy with that as my blue. I'm going to put a little more water into it, yet still because I feel I might be able to control the flow just a little bit better with slightly more water. And let's see if, okay, I think I'm going to go back to with a little more pigment in it because that came out a little too pastel, a little too much of a tint. We'll be learning about tints, T-I-N-T, not a T-E-N-T, in our another lesson next week. So I'm going to move this out of my way again physically, and I'm going to do that same, just give myself a little bit of a tilt to my paper. I'm going to put my hand underneath here and give myself a little bit of a tilt to my paper so I can use a modified idea of using the bead, or what I like to call the live edge. And I'm just taking the point of my brush and going right to the edge of my circle, painting it in as nicely and neatly as possible, taking that point of my number 6, moving that paint down slightly down those edges, and then I'm going to reload my brush just a little more, and again feed into that idea of the live edge, pulling my paint down the sides, the edge of that particular segment, keeping that idea of that live edge or the bead going, and I'm going to feed my next passage right into that bead and allow it to just flow down the paper and collect at the bottom of the area that I'm painting. And I can see I've got enough paint to extend down a little farther, and I can extend all of this paint down a little farther, and I'm getting a fairly nice wash in through this area. And I can see now also that my bead is, or my edge is not entirely live, so I'm going to feed some more paint in by adding paint to my brush. And looks like I forgot a little bit of an area there. I'm going to physically push that down so that way I get it as even as possible, and then go back into where that live edge bead is moving and work my paint from that angle. I'm just going back in, touching up the sides, and I've got that live edge again and moving that down, that live edge or that bead, moving that down. And I can see physically, again, I've got that idea of a live edge, probably have it a little too live, but I can catch it. Okay, so I went in, and now we can see that I don't have a whole lot of bead left. So I want to load my brush probably one more time, and I'm just knocking a little bit of paint off because I know I don't want as much paint as I've had previously on my brush, because I've just got a little segment left to fill, and I don't want to have so much paint on my brush that I overload this segment. And as I'm painting, I'm just manipulating my paper so that way the paint flows down and I still maintain that nice live edge. I can see here that I had plenty of paint left on my brush, so I left that excess paint on my brush, and I'm just going to use my brush here to absorb a little bit of what was left of that bead and then refine the edge that I was painting in that little segment. So it could have been a little bit neater in through here. It's easier to paint if I'm not actually on camera. It makes it a little easier. So let's see what happens now. Let's see if we, let's see, do I want to paint in that blue, or am I ready to paint in the red? I'm going to touch this yellow, and that yellow is dry to the touch, so I feel fairly comfortable going in and painting in my red segment. And I don't really have to mix a color, but what I have to do is pull some color, some of that red out of my palette and out of my pan and into my palette. So that's what I'm going to do now. And again, I'm just going to move this over and around to physically access my materials a little better and take some of this clean water, and you can drip it in either with your paintbrush, or you could again use a dropper if you have one and place a few drops of water into your palette and reactivate your watercolor paint this way. If you don't have any already sitting in your palette like I do, then of course you would move it from your pan here, and this is the number, this is, let me see here, I'm going to get a little edge of paper and wipe off the excess paint I've got over here. And this is the number 32 in your kit. So this is the red we are going to use as the red for mixing. Don't decide that you're going to use any of the other ones. This is the one we're going to use for mixing, so we can all be consistent and stay on the same page. I'm going to take my dropper and flush a little bit of this paint out of my paintbrush by diluting it with the water directly out of the dropper. I'm going to do that same test over here to see what the red is coming off of my brush like. So I feel that might work. I'm going to put, I'm always apparently a fan of just a little more flow to my paint, so I'm going to add just one drop of water. Okay, so I added 2. And I feel I'm going to be more comfortable with that. I'm going to moderate the amount of paint I've got on my brush by taking some of it off by pressing it up against the edge of the well that it's in. So let's see, by now this is slightly dry to the touch too. So I'm going to paint in that red segment, again just taking the tip of my number 6 brush and moving it right up along the edge of the segment of the color wheel that I've designated for red. I did not put a whole lot of paint on my brush. I'm going to reload that and get that idea of that live edge, or it looks like I'm going to go back into this because and I'm just going to allow that to run down to make it as even as possible. Get that to physically run down and then get my edge going that direction, my live edge or my bead. And that feels fairly comfortable. Feels like I've got a bead going there. And I'm just going to go ahead and feed that bead or feed that live edge, pull it down the boundaries of the segment that I'm painting, and I can go back into that edge again and move that paint around physically. I'm getting a really nice consistent wash. I may go back over this red again with another layer to make it more saturated because I want to keep up with that intensity of red. So very often with watercolor, you may find that you need to do more than one layer. What you do is you keep up the color that you've already previously mixed, you wait for it to dry, and then you go back over that exact area with more of the same paint, and it will get it darker. So this is lovely. Or I'm saying darker, but it'll actually get it more saturated, which obviously looks darker. So, but you know, darker may not entirely be the term that I was looking for. So I'll just say more saturated. So instead of allowing it to remain as a tint, we move it all the way to a fully saturated hue of red. So keeping that live edge again just by physically manipulating my paper. And as long as I have a live edge coming from all these different directions, I feel fairly comfortable that I'm going to be able to move my paint down and still keep it in a nice idea of a wash. And you see I'm just taking all of the paint off of my brush by depositing it onto one of the paper towels I have here, and that's because I can tell that I've got enough residual paint there that I can pull it down and fill in that area that I'm trying to complete without adding more paint. So I've got 3 of my segments painted in. And now let's paint in some of the other segments. I think it would be a good idea to paint in the secondary colors now, because I've got a decent amount of access to those secondary colors by virtue, let's see, so this is dry to the touch, this is dry to the touch. So I'm gonna mix violet up because I know I want to hold this paper this way, and this way I can avoid touching the wet red, and I can work in segments of the paper that are dry and access the area that I want to paint in physically on that paper. So now what I'm going to do is I have previously mixed some violet over here, and I mixed that by taking fairly equal amounts of this red and this blue and mixing them together. So I'm just going to reactivate this particular part of the purple that I've already mixed up. I'm going to clean my brush off, and then I'm going to add to this area just so you guys can see that it's true that I did in fact mix this purple up by virtue of taking this blue and that red. So we're not using any other colors in our palette. So even though we've got this wide range of colors in our palette, we just want to see the power of mixing only primary colors and see what that holds for us, what beauties that holds for us. So I'm going to put a little red in next to my purple and clean my brush off. And then I'm going to take a little bit of the blue and put that next to the red, and I'll mix that up, and you can see I get this nice beautiful purple, and I'll just mix that right into that mix that I've already have. Yes, I said purple. I know. We're mixing up violet for the purposes of the color wheel. So there, I've mixed up some lovely violet. Let's see what I've got on my brush. So I'm just going to go to my paper I've got over here, my scratch paper. I'm really happy with that violet. So I'm going to get some of it in my brush, and obviously I'm going to put it halfway in between red and blue on my color wheel, and it's conveniently pre-labeled by me, and in your instance it'll be pre-labeled by you. So we're just going to paint in that segment following the process that we have been following this entire time of using that idea of the live edge or the bead and gravity to do this nice wash all the way down the edges of this particular segment of our color wheel. I've got my bead is drying up a little bit, so I'm going to go back in and feed right into that live edge, move this edge down and defined that edge at the same time. I regained my bead, and so I'm just going to keep moving that down this segment of my paper and using gravity to help me keep that nice wash going with watercolor. So going back into that live edge or the bead and adding paint directly into that. I'm going to move it down, increase the tilt on my paper so that way I get that bead flowing really nicely. Again, going in, I see it building up on that edge, so I'm just going back into that and pulling it down into the section of the wheel where I want that color to go. And that's what painting is all about, really, is getting the paint to go where you want it to go in the color and the value that you want it to be. But right now we're just worrying about color mostly. We're worrying about saturation. So we might go back into this and paint a second layer. Again, that's very common with watercolor, is to paint in layers. So it looks like I am getting down to the bottom of my section, and I feel fairly comfortable with the amount of paint I can feel left on my brush and the bead that I've got built up here, that I'm going to have enough paint to move all the way down to the bottom of this section to get it completely filled in without reloading my brush. So as a matter of fact, I had too much, and instead of adding all of that excess paint to my water, you see I'm wiping it off on my paper towel so I don't get my water too oversaturated with pigment. And I'm just using my dry-ish brush to pull down what was left in that little puddle bead at the end. And I'm getting a little shaky on here. And again, that is simply because I have to manipulate my angle in order to not get my head and all of that under the camera. So ideally, you guys will be a little forgiving of me with that. Let's see if this red is not entirely dry to the touch. So let's see, what can I access? I can access the orange because I know the yellow and the blue are completely dry. So I'm going back in and just barely dipping my brush into the clean water to make sure if I've got any excess pigment on my brush, I get it all out. I don't want to add extra pigment with the dirty water, but it looks like I've got, let's see, putting it on it. Looks like I've got a little bit of pigment left in my brush. I'm pressing down fairly hard and twisting my brush at the same time to keep it in shape. So it looks like I was not depositing any more pigment onto my paper towel here. So now what we're going to do is we're going to mix up some orange. I had previously mixed up orange. And again, just to prove to everyone that I am in fact only using my primary colors, let's just take some of all of this wonderful yellow I've got over here and move it from this well out over adjacent to the orange that I already mixed up, and just move that over adjacent to here, moving some of it off of my brush by brushing along the edge of the well that it's in. So that way I make my paint go as far as possible. I'm wetting my brush a little again because I know that this red here has started evaporating a little, and I'm taking about half and half and mixing up orange with the about half and half red, half yellow, and that's about where I came up with this orange. Let's see what happens if I add a little bit more yellow to it. Do I feel it gets a little more orange? That feels a little more satisfyingly like orange to me. I'm going to take a little bit of just plain water, clean water, and throw that down into my little pile here. Get this entire area activated. I'm looking here and it looks like my paint is a little on the thin side. So I'm going to clean my brush out and I'm going to add in more pigment. I'm going to add in some yellow here and add in more yellow. That's not transferring as quick as I'd like to, so I'm going to add in a little more of this just pure solid pigment that I have from my yellow pad. Actually, if I add in that much yellow, that I find that much more of an orange than the color I had previously mixed up. And I'm pretty satisfied with that as an orange. I think I might want just a little slight more darkness in it. So I'm going to take the red that's in the crevice over here and push that into my pile here. I can even take a different brush and add a little bit of red into the middle there if I wanted to, and then mix that in. All right, I feel I am fairly happy with this idea of orange, and let's see if what happens if I put it over here on my scratch paper. I'm fairly happy with that mix that I've got, so I'm going to cover my, I like to keep this a paper towel under my hand the entire time I'm working, because this way I don't deposit any dirt that I might have from my hand on my hands, or the natural oil that we have existing on our hands. And again, I'm going to go back in and take my brush and go right up to the edge of the area I've designated for my orange. I can see, oops, I went a little too far over into my yellow orange. And I can erase that out to a small degree, but I'm not going to do it now because I don't want to lose my bead. And I'm going to keep feeding that edge. Looks like I could use a little more paint in my brush. Okay, so I do have a nice little bead going, and again, because we've got somewhat modified conditions that we're painting in, I am painting in a somewhat modified, and I'm going to put a little bit more water into there to get that paint moving around just a little more. Pick my paper up, recover that real quick, and I've got my bead going still. It looks like I could have mixed up more orange. Coulda, woulda, shoulda. And that's just because it's spreading out quite it's spreading out in my palette. And if it wasn't spreading out that much, I would have a bigger puddle. So I'm going around the edges, physics, gathering more of the paint that is available to me. Again, keeping the idea of that live edge or the bead going to try to get a solid wash in this area, so I don't have too many brush strokes. I don't want to add too much paint all at once because it will pile up on the surface of the paper instead of going down into the fibers and staining and dyeing them the way watercolor is designed to do. So just going back into that idea of the live edge, I can see I have a good amount of bead that I can push around on my paper to get the rest of my segment here painted in. So I'm probably going to have to go over most of these areas a second time, do what's called a second passage or a second layer on top of them to get them to even out in tone and saturation a little more. So I clean my brush up. It's fairly dry. I don't have a whole lot of excess paint in my brush. I'm cleaning it off again, and then I can go in and try to lift this paint that I got over in this area where I didn't want paint, and I just can go in with a clean water and then brush it over that area, and I'm taking my paper towel and pressing it down into that area. You see how I folded it to make sure that I got out or kept it in the same shape as the area, the edge that I'm trying to clean up. And I'm going to go in and put a little more clean water in here and brush that across the surface and try to lift that just a little more. Again, go back in with that really nice clean edge, go right up against it, and what I'm trying to do is absorb that color into the sponge, rather the paper towel. So that didn't do too bad. It removed the color fairly nicely. Let's see, that orange is drying fairly fast, so I've got my red is dry to the touch, my violet's dry to the touch, my blue is dry to the touch. So I'm going to go in and mix some green now. Now on to mixing up some green. I already had some green mixed up here previously, but like I've done with all of the others, I'm going to reactivate this green. My yellow has dried a little, my blue has dried a little. I'm going to reactivate those, and I'm not necessarily going to reactivate the entire well, but I am going to reactivate it to the point that I can take some of this pigment out and transfer it over to this well. And this is for the purpose of showing you the ratio that I'm mixing to get the particular green that I feel is a good, my idea of green, my mind's eye picture of green. So I am taking the pigment off my brush, cleaning it up before I stick it in that pile of blue, and I'm making sure that there is no excess yellow on my brush. I can stick, because there's not a whole lot of pigment leaking out of my brush, I can stick this in the water with a good amount of confidence. And so let's put this over here. And yes, this is running clean now, so I'm just going to have a little bit of water in my brush and take it into this pure blue area. And this is this blue from here, and I'm adding a little pigment just to show you that is that blue pigment. And I'm going to take some of this pigment and place it right next to this yellow and mix that in with the yellow and see what that amount of blue to yellow ratio, what value I get. And I feel that's a little darker than my idea of green, but I'm going to try to get as much of the pigment off of my brush as possible. Then before I put it back into the water again, I'm going to get all this pigment off so I don't get my water too dirty. It's okay to get your water dirty, but I tend to get as much of my pigment off my brush by putting it onto my paper towel. So now I'm going to just add a little more of this yellow from this well, because I felt that was too dark green, and I'm just going to add it to this pile that I have mixed here. And I still feel this is a little too dark. I'm going to take some of that off my paintbrush and take a little bit more of this yellow. I might take a little yellow from here and mix it, put a little side out here so you guys can see how much I'm mixing directly into my paint pile here. And I'm going to mix this in with the green I already have here, which was a little slightly lighter, but I'm going to mix it all together. I feel fairly comfortable with that green, although I think I might like a little more blue in it. I'm going to take a little bit of that green, knock it off my brush, clean my brush out a little more. Make sure I don't contaminate my blue, and I'm going to take a little bit more of this blue and add it in and get that all mixed up, the same color, the same hue throughout. I don't want any blue streaks or yellow streaks in it. I want it to be a solid green. So I feel that's sort of a green that I can live with, and that's the green I'm going to get out of mixing this blue and this yellow. I used about equal amounts, and I'm going to continue that same process I've been showing you throughout. I might tilt my, I'm going to tilt my palette over so I can concentrate my paint on this side of my palette. Again, physics. And this way I can have access to a larger puddle of watercolor paint, a little mixture here of this watercolor paint than I would if I left it on its own. So I'm going to go back in and put in that tilt myself by lifting my paper up a little. And let's see, I had a little cat hair on there. I'm going right up to that border of my green area again and painting in my green. I can definitely tell I'm going to need more pigment. Again, keeping that idea of that live edge going and letting that pile up down there at the bottom of my wash area, the same area that I'm painting in, this little pigment pile. You can see that that is what I've been calling the bead or the live edge. And I'm loading a little bit more paint into my brush because I could tell that I was running out. You can physically feel that when you're moving your brush across the paper. You can feel the amount of paint you still have left on your brush. If you can't feel that yet, that's what you want to develop a feeling for, is the amount of paint you have left over on your brush. So I've got that bead and just tilting my paper down. I'm going to add a little more paint to my brush, feed it into that live edge. I know I'm definitely going to have to go over this area again because I want it as saturated as that green in that area, and mine is not that saturated. So I probably could have put more pigment in both of my mixes, and that would have allowed it to look more saturated the first time I laid it down. So I'm going to add a little pigment when I go over this again. By going over it the second time is how I will add more pigment. So I've dried out my brush. I'm going to roll it to get it to a point, and I'm just going to take it here and use it as something of a sponge to take out that excess paint at the end of that shape. So I can mix up fairly freely any of these colors in between, and I don't want to mix up my yellow green yet because my green is still wet, and I'm not ready to mix up my blue green because my green is still wet. I still want to let that dry a little. So I think I'm going to move around the color wheel this direction. So I'm going to mix up yellow orange, and my brush is fairly clean because I already cleaned it off, but I'm just getting rid of all of the excess green on my brush. Again, I can be confident that I'm not depositing any significant amount of pigment into my clean water because I have to physically rub my paper towel to get the brush, the pigment to deposit off of my brush onto the paper. So I feel fairly confident about that. So what I'm going to get in order to complete this yellow-orange section is I already have this yellow set aside. I think I might put more yellow pigment in, having learned my lesson from previously. And I'll add this in, And I'm just going to add that yellow pigment straight into the orange mixture I already have down. I'm going to leave a little bit of that orange mixture available for myself to go over the orange a second time. I'm going to take a little bit more of this yellow out and add it to that orange. And I feel fairly confident that looks like a halfway point between the yellow and the orange. I can add in a little bit more of the orange into it. I'm going to put a little more water in here, and I'm being very careful in my palette not to get my yellow-orange mixture into my purple section. So this way I don't contaminate it. I'm keeping my colors really nice and separate at the moment. So I feel fairly confident that I have enough orange, yellow-orange there. I'm going to put a little more water in it. I'm going to clean my brush out, and I'm changing my mind and saying I'm not confident enough. And I'm going to add more yellow pigment to this entire mixture. And I'm going to take a little bit of that red on that side and add a little bit more red. Or I'll probably take a little more red pigment. So I'm going to take a little more red pigment from my damp pan here. I'm going to add that just over here, so this way I can moderate the amount of paint I put into my pile. I know I can add it into my solid red without changing the hue or value of this area of my palette, and I'm just going to add what's left on my brush into this yellow area. And I can see I've added a little more red than I would like because I'm starting to keep up with the color that I previously mixed and called orange. This is one of the reasons I left that orange there, so that way I can do a compare and contrast and change hues if I want. So I'm going to get a little more of the yellow, and I'm going to take some of this yellow from this area because I feel this paint is getting a little on the thick side, and I'm just going to mix that yellow in there. Make sure I get a yellow orange. I'm going to add a little bit more of the yellow hue into my mixture to speed up that process because I didn't pick up enough pigment when I mixed it there. And now I feel if I compare this yellow orange to that orange, it definitely feels as if it's closer to yellow, but if I compare it to the yellow across the way, it's definitely not that same color at all. So I feel fairly confident that I've mixed a color that's halfway between yellow and orange, and I'm going to call that yellow orange, and I'm going to paint in this segment of my color wheel with yellow orange. I'm laying that down and still following that same process of keeping that slight tilt to my paper, so this way I can have gravity help me out. We don't have to buy the expensive supplies since you're doing this for class, and not everybody here is an art major or is ready to invest in supplies. If you wanted to invest in supplies, there are supplies that you could either make or buy. We're not going to go into any of that at the moment, but I just want you to be aware that it exists. So I'm feeding that idea of the bead again and moving down the edge of my yellow section, taking the yellow-orange paint right all the way to the edge of both the orange and the yellow sides of the boundaries of my yellow-orange section. Keeping that idea of the bead, we can see that I need more paint on my brush. So again, I'm going back to my palette to gather paint. You see that I'm never painting using directly from my pans, but instead I transfer all that paint and I mix my colors into my palette, and it's from my palette that I want to paint. So I'm not painting using these little pads over here, these little pans over here. I'm painting using my palette. That's what I want you guys to learn how to do, is paint using your palette. So you can see I can go back and forth a little, and then I'm just going to line this up on the side here, use a little bit of gravity to work in my favor, move that down the direction I want it to move, and then take that idea of the bead and move it down the edges of the area that I'm looking to paint. I feel like I could probably load my paintbrush once more, but since I'm close at the end of the section that I want to paint, I'm going to push that idea a little and see how far I can extend that paint. Gather just a little bit more paint, and then I can pull all of that bead down and paint the tip of that area where it comes together with the other colors. Just using my brush to lift a little bit of that bead out, set it down, and let that dry, clean my brush out. All right. Now we'll mix up some red orange, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a little bit of yellow into my red, or I'll add a little bit of this orange, and I'm going to leave a corner for myself to remix. So I'm going to add a little bit of this orange into my red, and I'm just going to add it over here in this corner and take all of this red paint and compare all of this to the orange that I have left there. I'm going to have to mix more up to complete my orange area all over again. So I'm just going to take some of this paint that I have in this area and put it into my red to keep trying to get a red orange. I think what I'll do is, I know the colors that make red orange are going to be red and orange, and I'm just going to add a little bit more orange, or rather yellow, to this area and keep mixing the yellow directly into the red until I have a yellow orange that is lighter than that orange, that isn't the same as that yellow orange, but has more red hue in it. So I'm going to mix a little more of the red back into it to make it even. This is going to be red orange. So I want red to dominate just a little. I'm going to take my dropper and I'm going to take some of this red that I have just sitting up there on the side and knock that down into my little area here. I'm going to make sure not to activate this area so that way I don't get any of that purple paint in to my red orange that I don't want in it. It looks like I've got some red leaking into my orange, my red orange, so I'm going to make sure I mix it really nice and evenly and not have my color change in the middle of painting. So if I look at this now, it's definitely darker than that red, that orange that was down there before. But I still am going to take it just slightly darker than the orange. Red's a darker color than yellow, although yellow is surprisingly dark. So that's going to be my red orange, and that's definitely has more red in it than that orange that I previously mixed. So now I'm going to paint in my red orange section, and let's get that painted in. And we're going to do the same idea with painting in the bead, keeping that live edge. We'll probably have to do 2 passages of this color as well. So I'm going to go all the way up to that edge of that orange and refine that line in between them. And now I'm going to go catch all of the excess live edge and brush that across my paper. And I've got a little bit of a bead left. I'm going to load more paint onto my brush and keep working that idea of the live edge. I see a little bit of paint piling up over here, so I'm going to just take that as a bead and move it down to try to keep my wash nice and consistent. Moving that bead right along my paper, go back in, feed more paint in, and catch that bead and stroke it across the paper really nice and even. Move the edge down, keep that edge nice and refined. Try to keep it, take it right up to the edge of the orange and keep the bead going, the live edge going at the same time. I have a little bit of a gap, so when I paint my orange again, I might paint it a little tighter, but maybe I'll just take the red orange and cross over the orange just slightly. Probably went a little too dark there. Oh no. So I will, that's what I get for getting fancy, you guys. So don't be like me. You see that you can actually go a little too far with trying to make corrections, but I will move that down momentarily. So I'm just going to go over this section all over again because it's relatively, I'm doing a little bit of the wet into wet technique since I've already gone over it once, and I see that it's receptive to taking another layer already, so I'm going to move that bead over, and this way I get that nice wash going again, and then I've recovered my bead and I've recovered my value. I feel like I'm getting a little bit too dry with my mixture, and I need to add a little bit more water so that way my bead comes alive more. I feel like that's part of the reason my paint's getting a little gummy and tacky in places and the bead's not quite flowing, as I got a little too dry with my brush. So now I'm reaching back out and loading more paint onto my brush so I can get that bead, that live edge moving again, and move that paint down right as to make the 2 edges of those shapes meet. And we're defining the shapes, the little each section with the defining the edges by color. So we still are working with the idea of shape, but this time we've got that wedge of a circle as our shape and filling it in with color. So I'm definitely going to have to go back over that. I let that dry just a little and then add more pigment and move the paint down again, hoping to get a little darker and more even. I'm moving some paint off of my brush to try to move this around. This isn't always a good idea. It's usually not a very good idea at all. But let's see if I can get that to move around just a little more I'm gonna drop a little more pigment into this area and see if I can get it to move around fairly evenly by using gravity a little bit to my advantage. And then I'm going to take my somewhat cleaned up brush and pick up some of that pigment, go into an area, or the watered down pigment, and go into an area on my palette that's a little more dry and add that in for my pigment. I'm going to move it around to try to even that out a little. Even out the tone, the value in that section. So that looks fairly good to me all over. Again, let's see, my green's dry, my yellow's dry, my violet's dry. Everything is fairly dry, so I can mix, or I could go over a second layer, but I want to finish the entire color wheel and mixing, and then I'm going to paint it all over again, go over it a second layer, and I'm going to do that one. I may shoot it in time lapse, but I may not, and I just may show you the completed result, and you'll know that I went over it again. But I think what I'll do is I'll go over at least one more color for you on the color wheel to do a second layer so you can see the saturation go up, and then come to the understanding that you won't lift your paint if it's already dry, and you don't scrub with your paint, but you just go back over the surface again like you did the first time. So that's what I'm going to demonstrate, and then I will paint the entire color wheel, and then I'll show you the end result, how the second passage, with the second passage of paint, I came up with a more saturated version of the color wheel. And that's how I arrived at this color wheel too, is I did 2 layers, and that's how I got that level of saturation from my watercolors without having them pile up on the surface also. So let's mix a, let's see, red is dry. Let's mix a red violet. And I've already mixed a red violet by taking some of the red and putting it in to the purple, and now I'm pulling out a little bit more of the red and putting it into the pile that I had mixed as red violet, again keeping it away from the wetness of the yellow, of the red orange, and reactivating all of the paint that I've previously mixed by taking the purple and mixing it in with red to come up with a hue that is halfway between purple and red. And this looks like a pretty good, let's look, red violet. So that looks like a pretty good red violet to me. And I've just put it out here on the side of my old color wheel. And I think that is what I am going to use for my red violet, that hue. I'm going to wash off my brush, and I know I need more paint, so I'm going to go into my purple that I have mixed here, and I'm going into the thicker pigmented water and pull a little bit of that up and throw it into my red violet. And I see it's gotten a little bit more violet than I want. So I'm just going to take some of that red, again, not mixing it with the orange, and pulling that red out and getting enough mixture made up to complete the area that I want to fill for my red violet. So starting off, again, you know, I like to keep a cloth underneath my hand. And I'm going to start off with in my red violet section. That red orange is a little wet. I probably maybe could have started at a different section of red violet. Let's see what happens if I try to paint it this direction. And I'm sure I still can. So going in with my red violet right up next to my red, and keeping that idea of the live edge going, and tilting my paper going along this edge. I can still paint this shape in from this angle, take the paint all the way down this edge and paint in my tip first, and keep the idea of the live edge going. I think I got a little too dry. Oops. And I'm just going to mess up my clean water for the sake of my painting. I'll change it out in between shooting and take it the length of this and going on, taking a longer stroke. You see that you have to be a lot faster with painting, because otherwise your bead just really goes away fairly quickly because of the long distance that it's covering. So sometimes when you take a shortcut, you wind up on a longer road, or maybe the trip's just not as beautiful, or it's different than what you expected. So this is a getting down to the edge, and I'm moving my paper again to accommodate that, the physics, and get that bead moving and get a little edge and an angle going. So I've got the bead and I've just got the last little bit of my section to paint in with my red violet. And I've got a nice red violet end, and clean my brush. I feel like I have a little too much paint in here, and you can probably see that just going in with my brush and taking it out just so it does not pull up and get too dark in that area. And just moving this around because my brush is almost dry. And we're gonna go into blue violet now. And I'm going to take the blue that we have here already, and again, it's the straight blue from the palette. I'm going to take a little extra blue and add it into this blue we have here already. Rinse that off onto, and I'm going to get a little more blue, wet this up a little more, and again, I'm not afraid of contaminating my blue paint here because as you see, I've cleaned both waters, and everything I have here, it's just only blue in the water, so I feel fairly confident that there's only blue because there's only blue. So I'm taking more of this blue and mixing it onto my palette, transferring it onto my palette, cleaning off my brush in water, seeing how much pigment I have left, and depositing that onto a paper towel again, and that's coming off fairly clear. Yeah. Going back in the dirty end, taking a little more of it off, and let's see how it's coming out. I'm going to move this down. Move my brushes onto here to have more. All right, yay. Nice and clean. And now I'm just going to wet this purple I have over here. And when I say purple, I mean violet, because we are working with the 12 color wheel. I'm going to take this violet and mix it into the blue. Take some of that violet and mix it into the blue. And I'm going to come up with a color that is blue violet. And I've already have some blue violet mixed here. And I just wanted to show you here mixing And I'm going to take a little bit of that dirty water because, again, I'm fairly certain that the only thing I have in it is blue. And I'm going to make some blue violet here. It's going to be a little more blue than this violet here, and more violet than the blue that is straight out of the blue from the palette. I'm going to mix a little bit more water into it, and that's to get more of the pigment out of my brush. I feel like I can see how much pigment is in there. I'm going to go in and take a little more of this purple and mix it into my pigment, so I have a little closer to have a little more purple going, because I felt it was getting too blue. And now I have it right up next to some dry blue, and I'm fairly happy with how much I've got and the viscosity here. So I'm going to go into the blue velvet section now and paint that in. And I'm going the route of where I can make a shorter stroke, and that just is more in line with the physics that I'm working with here and the amount of time I've got. And that can be a unit of physics also, can't it? All right, getting more blue violet and feeding into that bead and right into that live edge that I've left, getting a nice wash of blue violet going, and we see how it's moving down that shape and still leaving a nice bead. So going into that bead and pulling it down with my paintbrush and moving more paint on, we see there's a nice bead still there formed, and I'm going to paint into that. And then again, using the physics of the paint, get more, rather the paper and the paint too, and get more pigmented water onto my surface of the paper, get that bead going. And now I've got a good amount of paint, and I'm just going to keep moving it across the area that I want to paint in. I've got a nice edge formed there with a bead on it, so I've got that nice live edge still moving, and I'm going to get more paint and add it into the areas where I've got that live edge and get more of the nice little wedge of that 12-step color wheel painted in, getting my blue violet section painted in, keeping that edge, that live edge, that bead, going in for just a little more paint to finish off this shape, pulling that paint down and allowing physics to take over. Looks like I missed a spot there. Catch up, catch up, catch up. Shaking it physically to get it to join the bead. And just moving some of this paint off to work what I have left with the rest of the bead. I moved a little too much paint off. Go back into the bead, put a little more paint on, and be able to finish off that section. I do have, you see, I've got a good amount of paint on that. I'm flattening it out a little and moving that paint down to finish off that section. And I've got a little section left. I'm taking what's left of that bead and completing in that section, moving it a little hoping I can get some of that pigment to move down. There's quite a bit of pigment there. Move down, move down. Let me get a little more. Yeah. All right, I think I will wind up evening that out and my next layer. And I've got blue-green. So with blue-green, I'm going to turn this around and I'm going to take, I've got some some green here left, and I'm going to take what is left of my green and take some blue and add it directly into the green and make myself some blue-green. Uh-oh, I'm gonna leave a little bit of green. Forgot I still need to make some yellow-green, so I'm gonna leave a little bit of the green so I know how far I need to go with the yellow-green. And I'm just gonna take some of that green that we have left and put it into this yellow. I know I still only have blue in there, so I'm going to take some of that and add it directly into this mix here. Again, I know it's not going to contaminate it. I'm looking at this blue-green and comparing it to the residual green that I have here. And I feel that that is a good compromise between blue and green. So I'm going to go into my blue-green section and do what I've been doing all along, and that is using the idea of the bead to keep the paint going. It looks like I've got some lint in my brush, and now I've removed it. I saw it stringing along. So I'm going into my blue-green section, and again, with the idea of that live edge or the bead going to a certain degree. The degree is 20. Yes, I'm using degree in two different ways, making puns, Professor Puns. So going along again and keeping that idea of the bead going or the live edge and feeding the next stroke into that bead and pulling it physically down, allowing the slope you establish with the paper to assist you, the gravity. Again, going back into that area, pulling out more pigment. Pigmented water. Whoa. And I can see that there is a difference in the viscosity. I've got, this is a much higher pigment to water ratio. And again, I'm hoping to compensate for that in my next passage. I don't really want to go back in and interfere with my wash. So coming down to the end and finishing that shape off. I'm going to take a little bit more water, and of course I can't resist going back in and making this a little more dark, because I do know that that's still wet. And this is relatively dry enough that I can go back over it and not disturb the paint underneath too much. And then I can take that and get a more consistent value in this particular segment. And move that down and get this darker again already to go darker, more saturated. And I'm saying darker because it is a dark color. So very often when you saturate, and most often when you saturate a particular color, you're also going darker with it. So it's going to look like, visually have a deeper value to it. Again, you see me cleaning off my brush here. Got quite a bit of paint up in that barrel, but that's not paint that's going to come off into my clean water. You see that I physically have to manipulate my brush even to get it off, so it's not coming off just by virtue of the water alone. So I need a little bit of a physical process to get it off too. So there, I've cleaned my brush more thoroughly without actually using soap. And then we've got a yellow-green left, and then the entire color wheel is painted in. And I'm gonna paint in the red, just so that way you can see what happens when I go back in and paint a second layer. So I'm gonna take the green that is left, and I'm gonna mix that green. I'm gonna leave a little bit of it over here so I can do a compare and contrast too. And again, since I know only blue is in my water and I'm going for a blue-green, I feel fairly confident to use my dirty water and mix that right in, because I'm adding a little bit of pigment, and the only pigment I'm adding is blue, and that's the only other pigment I want to add to this yellow area anyway. I'm just going to go back in here and take some of this blue-green, because there's no reason to go in and get more pigment when I've got all of this pigment here to use still. And I'm mixing up a nice yellow green. And I'm going to make sure that it's darker than that green and more, and not as yellow as just straight yellow. So now I've got yellow in there too, and I'm not going to really use that water again as a source for water. So I'm just taking more of that yellow because I felt my yellow-green just didn't have enough yellow in it. Now I'm going to finish the 12 color wheel off by completing in the yellow-green. And you saw that the only 3 colors I used were the primary colors: red, yellow, and blue. And we got all 12 of these colors from one. I'm going to move this again to be physically closer to me. So we got 12 different colors by using just 3 colors. We get such a wide variety of colors from just 3 colors. The 3 primaries: yellow, red, and blue. So I think throughout here you probably have even noticed, like, each pigment, it has physically different characteristics. Some of them, they move on the paper much more easily, and yellow is one of those pigments that just goes on much more smooth without as much work. You barely even need the bead to get a beautiful wash with yellow. Yellow just really likes to go on. So when you're using yellow as one of your mixing colors, it has a similar physical feel to it. So that's a lovely yellow-green, and I'm still going to go back over all of these again to get more saturation, including that yellow-green. That's just lovely there. Again, keeping that nice bead, going back in and adding more paint, because we can see it's drying out. The bead is going away. Hello, bead, you're back. Okay, here we go. And now I'm going to go back into that bead, that live edge, and keep that going and really complete that, all of the color in this segment of the color wheel. That feels like there's a good amount of yellow-green left that I can complete that entire section without reloading my brush, and it was true. As a matter of fact, I can go back, and I'm going to go in and take a little bit of that excess pigment out. All right, come on back down. I'm going to wash my brush out, and then I'm going to go back in, and the only section I'm going to go back over and show you on camera where I'm actually painting is going to be the red section. But I am going to do all of the other sections as well, and then show you the finished product. But I'm not going to go through and put all of those on video. I'm just going to do the red on video. I'm going back into my palette red, and I'm going to mix a new well because I don't trust that these are not contaminated anymore, and I'm going to play around with those later anyway. So now I'm just going to go and get more red pigment. I know I need more water in my mixture here, so I'm just going to get some more clean water, and I'm using my dropper to add moisture to the pan. And again, just using a whole new well here, and one that has enough space for me to swoosh the paint around to actually paint. So that feels nice, and even just moving it there, that feels like a really good consistency. Again, I will go and give it a nice little try. That looks lovely. So now I'm going to go over the red section, and I'm going to use this nice little new red mixture that I just mixed up again now, added water to. And so now I'm just, again, using that same idea of putting a wash down onto the surface where I've already painted, and using that bead to keep the wash consistent. Having physics work with it to physically move that paint around, and keeping that bead live, keeping that live edge going, and moving around, moving the edge around, going back in, loading more paint, keeping that live edge going, that bead going, and getting this whole area of red more saturated than it was before, going right up next to the edge of red violet and cleaning up that edge, moving that bead, moving the bead, and I'm leaning it against my palette here, and plus it's already warping a little, so I'm using that slightly to my advantage too. Going back in to feed that bead and keep that live edge going, and making this whole area more saturated. We see how much richer that red is, and the paint still has a really nice natural feel to it, instead of it rising up and creating something of a crust on the top of the paper. Now it's just doing its job as paint and coloring in the surface of the fibers, the surface of the paint. Instead of creating a layer of paint, it's going down into the fibers. And that's how nice and beautiful and saturated each color is going to be. And that's what the red looks like. Next time you see this, it's going to be completed, and all colors will be that saturated.